The committee will come to order. Without objection, all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. We meet today to examine the fiasco surrounding the Trump administration's decision to invoke emergency authority under the Arms Export Control Act, an abuse of authority in my view, and rammed through $8 billion in arms sales to Gulf countries. We'll hear testimony from Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs, Clark Cooper. Mr. Assistant Secretary, thank you for appearing before us today. Welcome to members of the public and the press, and thank you to our friends from C-SPAN who are broadcasting this important proceeding. Before I recognize myself for an opening statement, I want to just say to the members, I'm going to be a little heavy with the gavel today because we want to try to get in as many people asking questions as possible. So the 5 minutes will be pretty hard and fast instead of letting it go for 6 or 7 minutes. So I would ask people to please speak within the 5-minute recognized period. Let me say that the war in Yemen and America's role in it have been a major focus of this committee since the start of the Congress. I've made my views clear. While our Gulf partners have legitimate security concerns, the coalition's war effort has been reckless. We've heard too many heartbreaking reports about hospitals, school buses, weddings, and funerals wiped out in a fiery flash of destruction. At the same time, I'm also angry. I'm angry because once again the administration wants to cut Congress out of the picture, out of the process. We are a co-equal branch of government. That's the way our Constitution was written. And it is not simply the executive branch's decision to disregard what Congress's will is. And that we have seen, unfortunately, too many times, time and time again. Some of the weapons that caused the destruction are made in the United States. Other weapons made in our country have ended up in the hands of militias in Yemen, some of which are on the terrorist list. These are just a few of the reasons Congress has voiced deep concern about American policy on these matters and why offensive arms sales to the Gulf face a rocky path forward when subjected to congressional review. Let's be clear. Congress's ability to review arms exports is upheld by law and upheld by long-standing tradition. In light of these concerns in Congress, did the administration come to us to negotiate a path forward? No. Did they listen to members on both sides of the aisle who wanted greater assurances that American weapons would not be used in the slaughter of civilians? No. Did they pay the least amount of respect to a co-equal branch of government and its legitimate and vital role? No. No, instead they employed an obscure and rarely used provision of the law to declare a phony emergency, ram these sales through, and undercut Congress's ability to carry out its oversight role. If there were a real emergency, if our security were under such an imminent threat that the transfer of weapons was the only way to prevent a catastrophe, then we probably wouldn't be sitting here today. It would just be approved because it would be a real catastrophe. But here's the reality. There is no emergency. Do you know how I know? I know because a real emergency would require weapons that can be delivered immediately. If you need them right now, you want weapons that can be delivered immediately, not months or even years from now, as these do. A real emergency would require weapons that have already been built and are relevant to whatever the immediate threat is. A real emergency would not justify building new factories in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates to manufacture weapons that have been built in the United States for years and years. A real emergency would not be followed by our Defense Secretary telling us the threat has now diminished. Again, there is no emergency. It's phony, it's made up, and it's an abuse of the law, once again attempting to cut Congress out of the whole picture. This is not a dictatorship. We don't rule this country by fiat. Again, we are a co-equal branch of government. Remember when you were in school and you learned the checks and balances? Congress is a co-equal branch of government. We are not going to permit this to go by without a whimper. Just a few days before the administration notified Congress about this so-called emergency, we got a briefing on the threat that Iran poses in the region. I have no doubt that Iran is a threat to the United States, to our interests and our allies and partners. It's the world's most prolific state sponsor of terrorism. Its activities in the Gulf could paralyze commerce and air travel. Tehran has supplied the Houthis with dangerous weapons, and the Houthis have avoided negotiations to end the conflict, all while they've blocked assistance to help alleviate the world's worst humanitarian catastrophe. But this is nothing new. I obviously cannot talk about the details of the briefing we received, but suffice to say, though, we did not hear a single word about an emergency or a plan to move ahead with this sale. For this major fiasco, the administration quietly let us know on a Friday afternoon before a holiday weekend. It's really a slap in the face. Congress is going to have to give itself stronger tools before the administration just starts ignoring us completely. I have been working with Ranking Member McCall for months on legislation to make sure future arms sales only go forward if the country buying those weapons meets certain conditions. We'll also have to strongly consider changing the Arms Export Control Act's emergency provision, which the administration again has flagrantly abused in this case, and we're looking at every possible avenue for stopping these transfers before they go forward under this phony justification, including measures that members of this committee will introduce later today. But for now, I'd like some answers. I'd like to know about the process that led to this outrageous decision. I'd like to know who was involved, who thought it was a good idea to conjure up an emergency and cut an entire branch of the federal government out of the conversation. And we will get to those questions and others, Mr. Assistant Secretary, following your opening statement. Before that, I will yield to my friend, the Ranking Member, Mr. McCall of Texas, for any opening comments he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me first start out by saying what an honor it was to attend the Normandy ceremony with you this past weekend. Make no mistake, the Iranian regime is our strategic enemy in the Middle East. They are the #1 state sponsor of terror in the world today. They have a brutal history of American bloodshed, from the Marine barracks bombing in Lebanon in 1983 to the deaths of over 600 U.S. service members from 2003 to 2011. They continue to hold American hostages and plot against our allies in Europe. Iran's destabilizing behavior in the Middle East threatens that region and is a growing threat to the security of the United States, our military, and our citizens. Just last week, Marine General Frank McKenzie, our top military commander in the region, warned about attacks by Iran or its proxies, stating, "I think the threat is imminent." Our allies in the region face this menace every day. I fully support the efforts of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates to defend themselves against Iran, including U.S. arms and training. I support the efforts to combat the violent overthrow of a legitimate UN-backed government in Yemen by the Iran-backed Houthi rebels. These rebels repeatedly launch missiles and armed drones into Saudi Arabia, threatening innocents, including Americans. But I'm also troubled by the numerous civilian deaths in this war, including from coalition airstrikes. I firmly believe we can support our strategic partners while also insisting they prosecute that war more responsibly. And for this reason, I'm working with Chairman Engel on legislation conditioning certain future arms sales with the goal of helping stop civilian deaths. We are here today because the State Department recently certified to Congress that the Iran threat constitutes an emergency, requiring the immediate provision of certain defense systems to Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Jordan. This rarely used emergency authority bypassed Article 1 congressional review of these sales. The Founding Fathers put Article 1 first, which represents the American people, before Article 2 in the Constitution, and they did that for a reason. There have been times when international emergencies required expedited sales. For example, President George H.W. Bush used the emergency authority in the immediate wake of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. President Reagan made such a determination in 1984 during the Iran-Iraq War. In both of those cases, critical weapons were delivered very quickly during hot wars. But as I said last month, the recent use of this emergency authority, in my judgment, was unfortunate. Of note, some of these sales will not be ready for delivery for over a year. I would have preferred state to adhere to the formal statutory 30-day congressional review process to expedite these 22 arms sales where a resolution of disapproval process could have been an option. In fact, I had a very good conversation with Ambassador Bolton about a week or two before this decision was made. I discussed the legislation the chairman and I were working on, and I thought things were actually going in the correct and proper direction. I do share the administration frustration that some of these informal holds of these arms sales for over a year was a little too long. In your written statement, you have said that these arms sales are necessary to ensure the United States remains a credible supplier of choice for our partners rather than Russia and China. And I agree with that. Last week, it was reported that Saudi Arabia, however, has been buying ballistic missiles from China. And while we are not discussing ballistic missile technology today, it's disturbing if our allies are deepening their defense relationships with our adversaries like China. Assistant Secretary Cooper, I want to thank you for your service to our country in so many ways. In some ways we can't even discuss here in public. And I look forward to hearing your views on the threat, the decision-making process in designating this an emergency, and the details on these 22 weapons sales. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. I want to thank the gentleman from Texas, our ranking member. Our witness this morning is Mr. R. Clark Cooper, Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs. Mr. Assistant Secretary, thank you for coming. I recognize you for 5 minutes to summarize your testimony. Everything will go into the record, including your written testimony as well. Yes, Assistant Secretary, the floor is yours.
Chairman Engel, Ranking Member McCall, members. In recent days, neutral shipping has been attacked. By providing a deterrent against hostile actions, this transfer lowers the risk of a broader conflict. The determination reflects the United States' grave concern with the growing escalation in the Gulf and its implication for the security of our friends in the region. These words could precisely describe the context of the recent emergency certification this hearing has been convened to discuss. But they are actually from a State Department statement from 1984. Then, as now, Iran's revolutionary government threatened international shipping in the Gulf and, through its proxies, supported attacks on American interests in the region, resulting in the deaths of 241 American service members in Beirut. Then, as now, our partners required the reassurance provided by an American demonstration of resolve. And then, as now, the administration took steps to deter war, not to bring it closer. In his recent certification, Secretary Pompeo advanced a set of arms transfers to support our partners in this current crisis. These capabilities include aircraft support, munitions, logistics services, unmanned intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance platforms, training, and advisory services. None of these constitute introductions of fundamentally new capabilities to the region. None fundamentally alter the military balance of power. None are a nature or category that Congress has not previously reviewed and approved for these particular partners. The Secretary's decision to exercise his statutory authorities under the Arms Export Control Act reflect the current threat from Iran. But before speaking to that, I would like to describe the broader context. First, in today's world, our partnerships are more vital, not less so. We must ensure our partners that they have the capabilities, the systems, the communications, the intelligence, and the training to play their particular role in maintaining the stability and security of their regions. Our adversaries recognize the importance of our partnerships and have adopted purposeful strategies of trying to disrupt them at all levels, including in terms of our security cooperation. For instance, by seeking to replace us, as has been noted, as suppliers of choice. Congress is very much aware of this, which is why you passed the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act in 2017. At the same time, we deeply appreciate the particular considerations that relate to arms transfers. Many members, many Americans, are concerned about the use of the arms we provide overseas, including in the context of the Yemen civil war. These concerns are appropriate, and we share them. From the beginning of the conflict, we have maintained that a political solution is urgently needed, and we have supported the United Nations-led effort working toward that objective. Moreover, what makes America stand out from many foreign suppliers of defense materiel is the premium we place on ensuring that our capabilities are not contributing to gross violations of human rights. We have worked with the Saudi-led coalition over the course of its operations to reduce the occurrence of civilian casualties. Our support in this regard has ranged from the provision of training on targeting and the supply of more precise munitions to mentoring and advising the coalition on best practices, lessons learned, and integrating complex data into a system that is specifically designed to reduce civilian casualties. We've also provided higher-end legal training on the laws of armed conflict and have directly and regularly engaged both military and political leadership on this topic. So this is the context: the need to remain engaged partners, to ensure we remain their primary security partner, and to make clear that we support our partners in the defense of their realms and the security of their regions, and to deter our shared adversaries from disrupting those objectives. This mention of adversaries brings me back to the emergency cited by the Secretary in his certification, Iran and its malign activities. As Secretary Pompeo stated publicly, and as he and Acting Secretary of Defense Shanahan briefed to Congress, we have seen increased threat streams from Iran relating both to U.S. and partner equities in the region. These troubling and escalatory indications and warnings from the Iranian regime have prompted an increased U.S. force posture in the region. The Iran-backed Houthis publicly threatened to increase operations targeting vital military targets in the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and the Saudi-led coalition positions in Yemen. Add to this, as Ambassador Bolton recently described, Iranian attacks on commercial shipping off the coast of the United Arab Emirates, the unmanned aerial vehicle attacks on pumping stations of the Saudi East-West pipeline, and the rocket fired into a park just about a kilometer from our U.S. Embassy in Baghdad just a few days after that. And just today, a Houthi cruise missile fell on the arrivals hall of the Saudi Arabia's Aba International Airport, reportedly injuring 26 civilians. These provocative actions mark a new evolution in the threat Iran poses to the region, to our partners, and to our own national security, including the security of hundreds of thousands of Americans and their families who live and work in the Gulf states. It is this situation, this significant increase in both the intelligence of threat streams and clear, provocative, and damaging actions taken by Iran's government, that the Secretary did determine it constituted an emergency. It is this confluence of strategic priorities, the vitality of our bilateral relationships and partnerships, and the urgent regional threat that drove him to make the certification. Before closing, I would like to make one further point. In the process of his confirmation and my own, the Secretary and I each provided Congress with our commitments to the congressional review process for arms sales. This commitment stands. I value deeply Congress's role in the review of the arms transfer process. I take pride in the depth and the detail of the working relationship that we have with the committees in the course of this process. I do not view the Secretary's certification as setting aside of this process. Indeed, by carving out a certain set of cases in the context of a statutory authority long granted by Congress, the Secretary's action is an affirmation of the value we place on our engagement with you on arms transfers and broader security assistance issues. Mr. Chairman, in 1984, Ambassador Michael Armacost explained President Reagan's emergency certification to Congress in these words, I quote, "Our decisions were a prudent yet clear response to an escalating emergency which threatened Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. They satisfied a clear military need. In addition, we sent a political signal, both reassurance and deterrence. It was a measured response which promotes regional stability and security." Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, members, a political signal of both reassurance and deterrence, a measured response which promotes regional stability and security. These are the purposes for which President Reagan certified an emergency in 1984, and they are the purposes for which Secretary Pompeo invoked the same authority just 2 weeks ago. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. I'll now recognize members for 5 minutes each. All time yielded is for the purposes of questioning our witness, and I'll start by recognizing ourselves. Look, Mr. Secretary, Saudi Arabia is an ally, and they have legitimate security concerns. And Iran is not an ally. They're the leading state sponsor of terrorism and have all kinds of malign intentions. But it's not an excuse to cut Congress out of the picture. It's not an excuse to say we know better, and therefore Congress is superfluous or irrelevant. It is really a bad policy to act like that. The Houthis are bad. They threaten Saudi Arabia and civilians, but it doesn't mean that we give the Saudis a blank check. It doesn't mean that we look the other way when they drop bombs on children in school buses. I mean, I think there has to be some responsibility here, and I just do not understand the administration's decision to totally cut Congress out of the process when we have a process that works. And I really just hope this doesn't happen again. The State Department cited an increase in Iranian threats as a major justification for invoking the Arms Export Control Act emergency power provisions. I've long believed, again, as I said, that Iran remains the greatest threat to the region. But this appears to be a convenient excuse, a convenient way to get these weapons sales out the door without consulting Congress. So let's discuss the timing of these sales. When was the decision made to move forward with these sales under emergency authority? Was it before May 4th, when the White House announced the deployment of the carrier strike group to the Gulf? The New York Times reported last night that this decision was made in the spring, saying that, quote, Mr. Pompeo told State Department officials to find a way to push through the arms sales, unquote. So which came first, the arms sales or the threat? Defense Secretary Shanahan indicated that the Iranian threat had diminished. Does this mean the emergency no longer exists? So I understand that some of these items on the emergency list will take months, if not a year or more, to produce. So let me ask you this. What kind of emergency responds in months or years to circumstances you claim exist right now? And if the Iran threat were to be reduced in some way, would you move ahead with these transfers? These are all very important questions. I hope you can summarize them, because it really makes me more dubious, in fact, believing that the administration, for some reason, has decided not to partner with the Congress in these important issues. And I really think that in the future, the administration should change its attitude and work with Congress as working with the American people. We're all here to serve the same country and the same people, and we should not be cut out of the process and treated like enemies. So I'd like you to comment on anything I've said.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll start with the partnering with Congress and our communications. Yes, as I stated in my testimony, we value that engagement and want to return, and we have returned to the normal consultative process on arms transfers and sales. This is an emergency. This was a one-time event, as the Secretary stated. And I would note that the sales that were included in the emergency declaration certification had been through the consultative process and review with Congress. There was nothing new in those 22 sales, which does lead to your point about the release of those. On the DCS, or direct commercial sales side of it, yes, there are immediacy of receival of shipment in that sense. But as to an emergency on timing, yes, the protracted process did contribute to the conditions that necessitated an emergency. So in some of these cases, you're right, there's going to be a tail or a logistical latency on them. That tail or logistical latency has been built in because of the protracted process. But again, consultation, review period with Congress, that is desirous for all parties, for not only the legislative branch, but for the executive branch. It makes our transfers stronger. It actually provides accountability to the partners that are on the receipt of that. As for the timing of the emergency declaration, similar to the timing of the release on imposition of sanctions, the emergency declaration or that certification is in the Secretary's toolkit. It's a tool of diplomatic deterrence or prudential diplomatic deterrence. To say that it was preconceived is like saying that we're predetermining sanctions being issued to a particular partner. There are partners right now that we're looking at that we are reviewing potential imposition of sanctions. In this case, because of the uptick of the threat streams that were being reported, risking not only equities but persons made it more of a priority. Again, I'd be happy to talk more in a closed fora about those threat streams, but if talking about timing certainly was of the essence in regards to sending a message. Three audiences on that message, Mr. Chairman. One being the Tehran, sending a message of deterrence to Tehran. The other one, not mutually exclusive, is sending a message to our partners to reassure them that we are with them shoulder to shoulder, that we do value their sovereignty, that we do value their role in the greater region that they play to protect our interest and equities. And then finally, one that's been touched upon here already today, a third audience, was our near-peer adversaries. Our national security strategy is very transparent, so transparent that our adversaries see it as a way to also communicate in a fashion where they see opportunity. And what we don't want to do is we do not want to create conditions that would provide opportunity for our near-peer adversaries. So there was certainly a shared aspect on this declaration. The primary one being, Mr. Chairman, was the immediacy of the threat streams that were coming, and know that the threat has not abated.
Okay, thank you. Mr. McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We certainly hope this is a one-time exception. I think there is a process. This emergency was declared. There's an informal notification and a formal notification. Typically, when you start the informal process, it's an opportunity to negotiate and work things out. Usually that takes place within a matter of a month or two. Some of these holds have been in place for over a year. So in some respects, I certainly understand the frustration with the State Department. Having said that, getting the classified briefing, the top reigning general calling on his proxies to prepare for war, and our top commander in the region calling the threat imminent. Can you tell me what impact the authorization of these sales by the Secretary have had on these threats?
Sorry. In an open forum like this, I could tell you that there is a postured response. Again, our emergency declaration is just, I mentioned, it's a tool. It's not the only tool that our government has. There was citation earlier this morning about our force posture in the region. That also is a tool. It doesn't mean that the threat has abated, but it sends a very clear message to Tehran. But equally important, we are reassuring our partners that we've not abandoned them or that we've left them to carry the full load of responsibility in the region.
And do you think these precision-guided weapons that have been now sent, that certainly would help prevent some of this collateral damage that we're seeing?
Precise targeting would mitigate civilian casualties. It's not just the precision weapons, it also comes with the training. One thing that members who've been involved in the informal review process of not just precision-guided weapons, but any platform, what makes us a preferred partner, not just in the Gulf region, but globally, is we don't just provide ammunition, we don't just provide a platform, we provide a partnership. And a partnership comes with that, a long tail on training, capacity building, getting our partners to not only have the system, but actually operate in a way that we would find it acceptable by our standards, by USG standards. When I say training, that also is a matter of understanding the application of these things. It includes teaching them about the law of armed conflict. It helps them better understand what would be considered no-go for the targeting process. So it's not just a matter of conveyance of ammunition.
Now, this gets to the emergency issue. Out of these 22 sales, I don't know if you can answer this off the top of your head, but how many were ready to deliver in less than 60 days or have already been delivered in theater?
Thank you. So based on I'll do a quick little 101 on, so foreign military sales, and when we're doing the letters of offer, there is a process there that can take 20 to 30 days. Direct commercial sales, however, to your point on the immediacy, and it's the point that the chairman raised as well, to paraphrase a colloquialism our DoD colleagues refer to, pushing munitions is happening now, and actually has happened prior to this hearing.
How many would take over a year to deliver?
It depends on if it's not been built or manufactured, but if anything is what's called off the shelf, it's already moving.
And then finally, how many have not even been built yet?
I would have to follow up on that in detail. Part of the difference is if it's a direct commercial sale, we don't have, State Department doesn't have jurisdiction on the direct commercial sale export. It's on the FMS cases that we have that direct jurisdiction over.
Well, and my last point is that the chairman and I are working on legislation, as we had prior to this announcement, to authorize the sales. We understand the policy of arming the Saudis and this threat that Iran poses and the alliance between the Saudis and Israel. And we understand that the Houthi proxy in Yemen is a threat to Saudi and Israel in the region and to the United States. We just have an issue with the process. And we, I think, consulting with Congress is always the better route. I understand in this case there's an emergency. We are continuing our work in good faith on legislation to address future sales, and we hope that we can work with the State Department on this legislation. And I talked to Senator Risch yesterday about this as well, something that I think would be practical common sense that could pass House, Senate, and be signed into law. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McCall. Mr. Sherman.
I do agree with you that the Houthi are evil and supported by Iran. At the same time, you tell us that with more accurate targeting techniques and technology, Saudi Arabia will hit fewer hospitals. That assumes they're not trying to hit hospitals. I hope your assumption is correct. You tell us that you want to send a message with this to your adversaries. It appears as if your adversary is Congress, and the message is loud and clear. You will stretch every statute beyond its breaking point in order to make Congress irrelevant to the decision-making process. The arms sales you're talking about are controversial. There's significant opposition in Congress. And rather than confront that, you go around it. And so the issue is not what is our foreign policy, but whether we protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. We've heard some criticism from both sides of the aisle on this. The fact of the matter is, if Congress were united, we could stop this. We could go right now to those on the floor and demand that the rule be changed, and we make in order and protect an amendment to the Foreign Ops Appropriations Bill and the Defense Appropriations Bill pending on the floor today, requiring, and we could require that any transfer of weapons to Saudi Arabia or the Emirates get an affirmative vote by Congress. We could, at minimum, just repudiate this phony declaration of emergency. And so I'll yield to any Republican member that wants to join me in that effort. As you see, Congress is divided. You have defeated your enemy. Now, this declaration of emergency is bogus. A court may very well decide that in a few years. And if this one isn't, you can imagine that at some future time there would be a bogus declaration. Is there any personal liability that anybody in the executive branch faces if they just decide to ignore the Arms Export Control Act or come up with absurd definitions designed to claim to be adhering to it when a court would determine that they had violated? Can you basically do anything you want as long as you can say it with a straight face, as a practical matter? Or do you face, or do you or anyone else in the administration face any civil or criminal liability? Yes, please limit your answer to that question.
Thank you, Congressman Sherman. So no, the short answer is no. We're in compliance with statute.
Well, let's say that in some future decision you were not in compliance with statute. Because we don't, would you face any liability, or can you violate the statute with impunity should you or your successor choose to do so?
I'm not aware of anybody, regardless of branch of government, being able to violate statute at will.
But what is the outcome if some successor of yours decides to violate the statute?
I'm not going to gander it. I'm going to focus on what is
I would
legal,
hope
what's not
that
legal,
you would
sir.
get legal advice on this.
Yes.
Because as extreme as this administration is, it is quite possible that a court would determine that you folks have gone too far, that you have violated the law, that there is not a good faith emergency, and that those involved are deliberately, intentionally violating the Arms Export Control Act.
Congressman Sherman, this is in compliance with the Arms Export Control
You
Act.
think you're complying. Many of us do not. And who knows what the determination of some future tribunal or court would be. We have swung very far in the direction of presidential power. The question here, it appears as if you've determined that the emergency is that Congress won't agree with you.
No, sir.
Well, you told us that you wanted to do. We didn't approve. And so you declared an emergency. If Congress had promptly agreed with your plans, would there be an emergency?
Yes. So an emergency are conditions-based, and I'm glad you asked that question, Congressman Sherman. The conditions that we've discussed here today, and we can discuss further in another fora, not only were the threat streams emanating from Tehran, there were the conditions of the readiness of our partners, ensuring our partners that we stand with them. And then there were also the conditions of looking at near-peer adversaries, looking for opportunistic...
Right, so you decided that whatever policy you want to carry out must be carried out, and that anything that prevents you from doing it, even for a short time, constitutes an emergency. Please read the Constitution. I yield back.
Thank you, sir. I've been swearing to support the Constitution for over 20 years in different capacities in my career. And Congress is a partner. We are partners with Congress. We will continue to work with Congress on reviews.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman. Mr. Perry.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretary Cooper, for being here. If you can generalize, how long have these sales been in the works?
Thank you, Congressman. So not each sale, but many, there are a number of sales that have gone up to 18 months. So it was been raised here that this is where we get into partners being concerned, not surprising through engagements not only with members of Congress, but in bilateral discourse, there's been concern about our ability to be standing shoulder to shoulder with partners who are carrying a number of equities for us in the region.
And during that 18 months or throughout that 18 months, has Congress been made aware of the administration's intent to make the sales?
Yes, Congressman. In fact, going back to the process writ large, the informal review process includes a lengthy consultation period. I think a number of members already cited the normal turnaround time, depending if it's a NATO or non-NATO partner, it could be anywhere from 20 to 30 days. That's usually when issues may be flagged or identified by the Congress that we're able to address. Why we have that period of time and why it's done in a fashion that is just between the Department and Congress is because these are issues that need to be resolved inside the USG, inside U.S. government. So we're not exposing our partners to our own internal scrutiny. But normally, it can be up to 30 days. In these cases, we were reaching months, if not close to 2 years.
Yeah, 18 months is a little longer than 30 days. If you know, how long ago did Senator Menendez object?
Again, some of these cases go back to over 18 months.
And is the fact that Senator Menendez objected testimonial to a certain extent to the fact that the administration is complying with the process? Because if you weren't complying with the process, Senator Menendez wouldn't have had the opportunity to object.
And to that point, after the emergency declaration, we returned immediately to that process. So there are cases that are currently under informal review right now before the Congress right after the declaration. So the process has not stopped, essentially. The declaration was a highlight of 22 particular cases, but the process of informal review, tiered review, notification never stopped.
Did you, Mr. Secretary Cooper, did you receive a request from this committee to conduct a classified briefing regarding these sales and the particular circumstances surrounding the sales from a threat perspective prior to, that we would have that briefing prior to this hearing?
Congressman, I know that we had offered a classified briefing. The offer still stands. Happy to come back either in a closed hearing or in a briefing setting. We were not able to secure one. But again, happy, if there's interest, happy to provide that. There is threat stream data that is worth noting. There was citation of some of that by Central Command General McKenzie. I think it was cited here. But in an open forum, we can't go there right
So you
now.
made the offer, but did the committee request a classified briefing regarding the actions precipitating the emergency declaration regarding these arms sales prior to this hearing?
No, sir, not that I'm aware of.
Would you say that this move is based on new intelligence received regarding Iran in particular?
Short answer is yes. A little bit more to that is that there were evolving threat streams. I think one thing that we can note is that there is always a persistent threat. Several members have noted that here today, that's not going to abate, not just direct threats, but through proxies outside of the region, threats to our equities outside the region. That's not new. What was new was the particular uptick in the threat posture.
Well, thank you, Secretary Cooper, and I, for one, if I have the authority to do so, I'm requesting a classified briefing at your convenience and availability regarding the actions precipitating the sales. And if no one else wants to attend, I'll be happy to sit down with you myself and do that. So I'd like to work that out with your schedule. Just want to remind all my colleagues that we're here for the United States of America, for the security of the United States of America, and remind my colleagues on the other side of the aisle that when I brought up the fact that the IRGC was driving around in M1 tanks, American-made M1 tanks, no one here seemed to have a problem with that during the last administration. When the last administration sent pallets of cash to a vowed enemy of the United States, nobody on the other side of the aisle seemed to have a problem with that. And when the last administration crafted the JCPOA to expressly exclude Congress, nobody on the other side of the aisle seemed to have a problem with that process either, and I yield.
I just want to quote my dear late mother who used to tell me 2 wrongs don't make a right. Let me call on Mr. Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, one thing that I think that all members of Congress do agree upon, that Iran is a bad actor, and that Iran has done things and continues to do things that threatens the region. One thing I think that some members also know, maybe not everyone articulates it, that Saudi Arabia also does not have clean hands. And they too, at times, malign the region. And they too bring such, because when I think about Wahhabism, that's a threat to us. When I think about who were in those planes that, I come from New York, that destructed the World Trade Center, They were Saudi Arabians. When I think about the tragedy that continues to take place in Yemen and the killing of innocent people in that regards, I believe it is our responsibility to also hold them in check. I think that it is important that when you see the killing of an American columnist, that we should say something and do something in that regards. Now, it seems to me that the administration realizes that also, because the administration, I just saw the president yesterday talk about a beautiful letter that he received from Kim Jong-un. Kim Jong-un does not, I believe in talking to our adversaries, but Kim Jong-un doesn't send beautiful letters when we see him killing his own people and starving his own people, as is similar crises that's continuing to take place in Saudi Arabia. So the concern that members of Congress have had was about how our partners were using the weapons that they received and how that was fueling the conflict in Yemen and creating the worst humanitarian catastrophe possibly in the world. These concerns still have not disappeared. The administration did not come to Congress to ask how to move forward with these sales and did not make any policy changes to assuage our concerns. The administration could have sent the sales to Congress under the regular notification period, allowing Congress to disapprove, 30 days to disapprove. 3 days prior to the emergency declaration, there was a classified meeting, and the secretary was there. He did not mention at all that there was an emergency situation. Yet just 3 days later, all of a sudden, there was an emergency situation. It seems evident that that was utilized to get around Congress, because some in Congress do want to hold everyone accountable for their actions and to make sure that we are setting a standard. My concern and question when I just looked at the number of motor bombs, 15,000 motor bombs that may end up in the hands of militants in Yemen and may be used against civilians. So my one question to you is, why in the world would a regime need 15,000 motor bombs in the scenario that we're talking about? Yes, sir.
Thank you, Congressman Meeks. We'll start with the munitions and weapons. As cited in my testimony, we have partners that are under direct threat. They're not just carrying our equities or our water. We just had an attack by the Houthis on a Saudi Arabian civilian international airport. So it's not just a matter of defense, it's a matter of posture in Yemen. As you noted, the Houthis are Iran-sponsored, so this isn't just a matter of a civil war. This is addressing a greater threat. As to the threat streams, it is ever-evolving. So yes, Congress was briefed on the threats by state, by defense, and yes, there was a constant assessment process taking place before that briefing, after that briefing. Even today, the intelligence community with the executive branch monitors that threat for changes in posture. So it did necessitate the emergency declaration. And we're with you on accountability. Holding a partner accountable, any partner, doesn't preclude us from working with a partner. If anything, detaching ourselves from a partner, removing ourselves from our partner, puts at risk ensuring that accountability. So, no. Having a security cooperation status with a partner doesn't mean we don't hold them to account on human rights. It doesn't mean we don't hold them to account on rule of law, and it doesn't mean that we don't hold them to account on civil society.
Thank you, Mr. Meeks. Mr. Yoho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Cooper, thank you for being here. And I think the question's been raised about why the administration took this route versus the normal route, and I think that's been covered. I realize you may not be able to say, and you've already stated that you can't say much in this setting, and I asked the chairman to hold a classified briefing with this committee, if the chairman would do that to second what Mr. Perry said, because I think there's confusion. And if we're not united as a government, it shows confusion and weakness to any adversary we may have. And I think the best thing that the administration can do is work to get all of us on board of why, because I question some of it too, and I want to support the administration, but without having a SCIF type of briefing, what we have over there at the Capitol Visitor Center is not real in-depth. And so I asked the chairman to hold that as soon as possible so that we can be on the same side of this. We've certainly learned that when an administration moves past or bypasses Congress, like the Obama administration did with the JCPOA and passed over $1 billion to Iran, the consequences of that take a long time to go back and correct. And we don't want to make that mistake. We've heard reports of arms going into the hands of people we don't want them to. And what guarantees do we have that this equipment won't get into the hands of radical Islamic terrorists like the 5 or 6 different ISIS terrorist groups that are in that region?
Thank you, Congressman Yoho. And yes, would reaffirm that be happy to come back to have a further conversation on the classified setting. As to the point on the delivery of systems and weapons to coalition partners, this is part of our relationship in a bilateral sense of the advocacy and the credibility of what they are applying, where they're applying it, and who has actual command and control of whatever weapon or system is in place. That is constantly part of the program. Earlier mentioned that when we provide a munition or an arms transfer, it doesn't just stop at the transfer. It does come with a longer tail, not just on providing capability and sustainment, but also accountability as well. So it's not limited to just provision of a good. There's an accountability aspect there. This is actually part of the portfolio in my part of the department is when we actually do follow up. And in some cases, we do precondition future transfers based on their ability to account for munitions or arms.
Let me interrupt there, because I've got reports of the radical Islamic terrorists having man pads that went to Saudi Arabia. Now they have them. We need better safeguards, and I guess a more direct question is, what information have you requested from Saudi and the UAE and Jordan about how the defense articles transferred as part of these sales will be used, so that we have checks and balances, because we suffer the consequences of that. If you kill one radical terrorist, 20 get born out of that, and we're the ones that our name's on that ammunition and they know it.
Thank you. Congressman Yo, it is incumbent upon us from a non-proliferation aspect, a protection, a command and control of those elements, those arms, those munitions. As to talking about certain aspects of that from a bilateral sense, I would like to save that for when we're together in a non-open fora. But I would like to add that on the man-pads issue, members may or may not know that there is an interagency task force on the tracking of, the decommissioning of, knowing where they are in the globe. That interagency task force actually is housed not only at the Department of State, but it's within my part of the department. So we do have jurisdiction on that specifically from an interagency standpoint, and happy to talk about that further.
All right, thank you. And one more important question. Do these sales threaten Israel's qualitative military edge, and has Israel expressed any concerns about these sales?
I can tell you that on any sale, not only these sales, every sale, QME is part of the analytical review process. I don't want to talk into detail about our bilateral communications in an open fora, but with every sale, as you mentioned, QME is an assessment factor.
Thank you for your time and your service.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Yoho. Mr. Sires.
Secretary Cooper, thank you for being here today. You know, following up on the concerns of the transfer of arms, that we make sure it doesn't wind up in the wrong hands. I think this is why the process of going to Congress and making sure that we are part of it is important. Because at the end of the day, when these arms are found with Al-Qaeda, like they were in the past, you know, they're going to come to us and say, well, you didn't supervise this, you didn't keep an eye on this, and we have to answer the public because they know that there is a process by which we approve these arms sales. So at the end, you know, it just seems that the administration always likes to bypass Congress. And then I go back to my district and I have to answer, why do they think that it's important for them to just go about doing business without the approval of Congress? One of the most important things in this country is the fact that we have checks and balances. So, you know, let's get with it. Let's go back and tell them that, hey, we are part of this country. And the other issue that I have, are they running out of ammunition? Are they running out of arms or the Saudis that we have to do this in an emergency? What, you know.
Thank you, Congressman. As to talking about particular readiness and capacity posture, I do not want to talk about that in open forum, but what I can say in an open forum is that reassurance we provided to not just Saudi Arabia, but the other Gulf partners in the emergency declaration was not just the message, there was the material aspect of it, but to particular readiness and capacity issues on any bilateral partner, we would not want to have an open fora. And yeah, I'm with you on the relationship with Congress. This is why I emphasized in my testimony the value of having the review process. All these cases have been under congressional review for quite some time. It doesn't preclude any review of any future cases, and we did, as soon as the one-time declaration was issued by Secretary Pompeo, return to the normal review consultative process with Congress.
You know, and I always get a kick out of these classified briefings because it was supposed to be classified, the type of arms that we're selling to the Saudis. I mean, I think everybody in the world knows that has a list of what's going there. So how classified do you do that when everybody seems to have a list of what kind of arms they're getting?
The sale, the transparency aspect is not classified. What is classified is when we talk about any partner's capacity or readiness. We certainly would not want an adversary to know the strengths or weaknesses of any of our partners.
Well, Mr. Secretary, all I can say is keep us informed. It seems to be that this administration has a habit of just doing things without informing or not even turning information over to the Congress that we need to make our decisions. It seems that we have to constantly go to court. Some of the other committees have to constantly go to court to get information. It's like pulling teeth from this administration, information that belongs to us so we can make our decision. I know you don't have an answer to that.
Well, I do. All the information, as you mentioned, there is no secret about the cases here because we do operate in a transparent fashion. So the cases have been under congressional review, in some cases almost 2 years. I don't know how more consultative we can be in that sense. This is what probably contributed to the Secretary's decision point, the primary one being the uptick in the threat streams. But the process has been in place. We value the process. We're not walking away from the process, but in this particular case, an emergency necessitated a declaration to move forward.
And we all get the fact that Iran is a bad actor. And we all understand, at least I understand, how important it is to make sure that Israel, all right, is not overpowered by Iran and its minions. So it's important. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sires. Mrs. Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, over here, and thank you, Secretary Cooper, for your time and certainly for your service, and also at the beginning when we were all casually talking, your offer to bring this committee together in a closed and classified setting. So I appreciate that very, very much, and I think it would do much good, because I much agree with my friends across the aisle and colleagues on this side of the aisle that oftentimes what happens over at CVC is inane. So while I understand the strategic imperative to reassure regional partners standing against an aggressive Iran, I am seeking to better understand the administration's decision, I think we all are, to sidestep normal processes, especially giving ongoing reports, frankly, of Saudi human rights abuses. Very important to me. Russia remains, sir, the largest arms supplier to the strategically important Asia-Pacific region. How do the pending arms sales to partners in the Middle East affect long-term efforts to convince Asia-Pacific countries to buy American?
Thank you, Congresswoman Wagner. I actually just came back from South Asia, and there were some honest, if not difficult, conversations with partners about their current status. They're wanting to have a more deep, fulsome relationship with the United States. However, they needed to find ways to off-ramp some legacy requirements or legacy equipping from, say, Russia. Earlier in this hearing, I referenced in my testimony CATSA sanctions.
Right.
That's a tool. That is a tool that Congress provided the administration. It is certainly a tool that's available in any of our partnerships. Again, being in an open forum, I don't want to go into detail where we're looking for that to be applied, but it is certainly something that having that as a tool factors in our discussions and negotiations bilaterally with
Well, I'm
particular
comforted
partners.
to know that you were there and that you're having these discussions, and I look forward to perhaps some more detail in that regard. So, if, as you mentioned in your testimony, none of the sales would alter the military balance of power in the region, why are emergency procedures necessary, Mr. Secretary?
Yeah, again, as noted, these were not new sales. We're not introducing new technology, new capabilities. What made it an emergency was a confluence of these conditions. So when one looks at the conditions not just on where our partners are or where they assess we are, there was the immediacy of the threat streams emanating from Iran. So the direct threats, not only to our interests, but to our partners as well. Couple that, the being able to reassure our partners that we're still with them, and then also add to the layer, also referred to here earlier, of sending a message to our near-peer adversaries that do not take advantage of the current threat posture in the region. We are standing with our partners.
Secretary Cooper, you explained in your testimony that China and Russia are, I believe you called them secondary audiences for May's notification. Can you explain how the emergency notification advantages the United States in competition with Russia and China?
Yes, thank you. Russia and China are extremely aggressive in their advocacy for sale, pushing their arms and munitions to anybody. They usually do it at a cut price, cut rate. They certainly don't do it in a transparent fashion the way we do it. It is unique that the United States arms transfer process by statute and by policy is done in such a transparent fashion, not only for our accountability to the taxpayer, but also our accountability to a partner who we're investing in. We also, as I mentioned, have a long, what I'd say, tail of support with our sales that is not replicated by our near-peer adversaries. We provide not just training, sustainment, we're with them along the way, and it's important to factor in that training and sustainment, it's inclusive of human rights, rule of armed conflict, making sure that our partners are using these systems in a way that we would find appropriate from our standards. Sending that message to our near-peer adversaries is to say, do not take advantage of a situation in a particular conflict area, and by no means think that we're stepping away from a partner who we're working with, who is not only protecting their sovereignty in their region, they are carrying equities on our behalf, on behalf of American national security.
Thank you for your time and your service. My time has expired. Mr. Chairman, I yield back, and I look forward to our further discussions.
Thank you, Mrs. Wagner. Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here, Mr. Cooper, Secretary Cooper, and thank you for your service to the country. You said earlier that you want to make sure that with actions that the administration took like this, that you want to make sure the transfer appears stronger. You want to make sure that we're making sure our partnerships are vital. Well, what about the partnership with Congress that's required under the Constitution, the partnership that is there as an equal level of government? And how can it be perceived as stronger in a statement because of the actions that were taken by the administration for a so-called emergency when next week it appears the Senate is going to take 22 resolutions of disapproval and vote against this, and it would only take a president's veto to overcome this? And you're here today in front of this committee asking questions that should have been asked and answered before this was done. How is that possibly making our country look stronger when this action divides our country, not only internally, but in the eyes of all those allies and not internationally? How can that possibly be stronger?
Thank you, Congressman Keating. Actually, having this hearing is stronger. Our open society, our discourse is a message of strength.
I hate to interrupt. My time is limited here, but it's not stronger when it happens afterwards. It's not stronger. Now, you've been, you're Assistant Secretary of Political Military Affairs, the Secretary, so you do have some knowledge of the crafting of this memorandum of justification. Is that correct?
That is correct, sir.
Now, is Jared Kushner part of that? Was he at any meeting?
I am not going to talk about anything pre-decisional, but what I can tell you, this is a Secretary of State policy decision.
Excuse me. You want it both ways. You're not going to talk about anything pre-decision, and you're here. You can't talk about everything after the decision. I mean, we're here to ask questions about the pre-decision. So how can you sit here and say you're not going to you're dismissing us?
I'm not, sir.
You're just saying we're not going to talk about it.
I may.
Answer this question. Was in any way, indirectly or directly, Jared Kushner involved in any discussions on this? Was he involved when there was the Saudi summit? Were there discussions about this? Was Jared Kushner, since you're in a position to know, in any way involved in this whatsoever?
Congressman Keating, what I can tell you that I do know is that Mr. Kushner doesn't have an interagency role in the review of these cases. These cases were done in the interagency process that we discussed earlier.
Cases.
The 22. This is the 22 cases in the emergency declaration.
What about the overall issue of providing arms to the Saudis? Was Jared Kushner involved in that? Don't define it so narrowly.
I'm not defining it narrowly. I'm talking about the emergency declaration that was conditions-based. So I can talk to you about the conditions.
No, I want you to answer my question. It's pretty simple. You were involved in all of this. Was Jared Kushner involved? How can you not answer that?
Not in the emergency declaration.
No, I'm not asking that. In discussions with the Saudis about arms sales.
There are a number.
It was a predicate to this.
Okay, I see what you're asking. On bilateral communications from ambassador, country team, mill-to-mill relationships, there are a number of lines of communication with our partners, be it Saudi Arabia, including Saudi Arabia, that include a host of government officials.
Was he involved?
Not in the emergency declaration.
No, answer my question.
Okay, I am, sir.
Evidently, you're not answering the question. How is that a tough question?
It's not.
This is a man that's in charge of the Middle East peace process. He's got a direct line to the Saudi leadership. That's well established. He has discussions all the time with the Saudi rulers, himself sometimes in private. So tell me,
Congressman
why
Keating,
can't you answer that question?
I am. Congressman Keating.
No, you're not.
Congressman Keating, there are multiple lines of communication with our partners in Riyadh, including here in Washington, as well as our embassy with
I
Ambassador
didn't ask you about
Abizaid.
the multiple lines. Is Jared Kushner?
He would
has
be one of the
inter-
lines of communication as any
He was
government
involved.
official.
Is that
no,
a yes?
sir. That's not what I'm tracking.
I've got 16 seconds.
So we're talking about an
I've got
emergency
16 seconds left to
declaration
answer
that was
the
a
question.
policy decision by the Secretary of State that was based on
You didn't-
conditions.
I'm sorry, my time is up. I'm going to have to yield back. I didn't get an answer.
Thank you, Mr. Keating. Mr. Curtis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to personally express my appreciation to you and the ranking member for holding this hearing. I also would like to express, like many of my colleagues, frustration that we find ourselves here. I, too often, as a member of Congress, am reminded of what it was like to raise 6 children and hear their squabbles and their differences. And not too different than that, I find plenty of blame to go around on all sides. As a member of Congress, I think we're frustrated more than we would like with powers that we believe belong to us not being exercised. If I were to put myself in the shoes of the President, I would be very frustrated if my lot was dependent on a dysfunctional Congress who time after time couldn't act together and resolve these problems, as is our responsibility. I would like to associate myself with the comments of both the chairman and the ranking member and move just slightly onto a slightly different view of this issue and talk about what concerns me even more, and that's the situation on the ground for the civilians in Yemen. And I'd like to know, in your opinion, what the United States government is currently doing with Saudi Arabia and UAE to minimize civilian casualties in Yemen and ensure adherence to the Geneva Convention and deal with the humanitarian crisis on the ground. In my mind, there's one justification for the United States being involved in this, and that's that we can make it better for Yemen than if we weren't involved, and I'd like to hear your comments on that.
Thank you, Congressman Curtis. Yes, I'll start with no question about the conditions, the deplorable humanitarian conditions, the heartbreaking conditions in Yemen. As stated earlier, we are fully supportive of the United Nations-led political process to get resolution, to seek resolution in Yemen. As to enabling our partners to be better at mitigating not only civilian casualties, but mitigating any kind of contact with civilian infrastructure, that comes with training. That is in place, that's in process. There are evidence and elements of improvement that's been reported from the field on that. However, decoupling ourselves from our partners puts at risk, at greater risk, further civilian casualties. So it's not to say that it's going away immediately, but the work is there, the commitment is there. Our being tied to our partner, our being committed to our partner helps ensure mitigation of civilian casualty as well as destruction of civilian property.
Thank you. I would like to join with my colleagues on 2 points. One is to thank you for your service, and the other, Mr. Chairman, is to ask for further classified briefing so that we can better understand the conditions here and the type of classified briefing that would allow us to go into much greater detail than we frequently get. Thank you, and I yield my time.
Thank you, Mr. Curtis. We'll talk about another classified briefing. Thank you. Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling this hearing on what is an egregious and legally questionable move by the administration to transfer weapons to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Let me be clear. I believe this committee, on a bipartisan basis, is absolutely committed to supporting America's allies. We're committed to defending America from emerging threats, and we're committed to our security. But we're also committed to upholding the rule of law, the Constitution, and the respect for human rights. The administration is trying to abuse the law in order to sell weapons to supposed allies, Saudi Arabia and the UAE. These are countries that are already using American-made weapons in a campaign in Yemen that has resulted in innocent civilians being targeted and killed. The justification for this appalling action by the administration is a bogus emergency. The administration claims that Iran poses such an imminent threat to our allies that emergency assistance is needed for Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates to defend themselves. This is an administration that has cozied up to Riyadh, sweeping aside gross human rights violations, turning a blind eye to the Saudis, taking a buzzsaw to a Washington Post journalist, and supporting an intervention in Yemen that is causing famine, destruction, and a mounting loss of life. Just because you don't like the process doesn't mean you get to ignore it. In your opening statement, you noted the importance of being able to send a political signal with these arms sales. It does send a signal and a message. It's a message that we abandon our principles if you write a big enough check. Congress does not agree, and the Constitution doesn't permit it. So I'm going to begin. We understand, Mr. Cooper, I want to follow up on Mr. Keating's question with respect to the role of Jared Kushner in this process. Was Mr. Kushner in any meetings that you attended on this topic of arms sales broadly to Saudi Arabia? That's a yes or a no.
Mr. Cicilline, I will not talk about pre-decisional in this fora, but I will tell you that from an interagency standpoint on assessment, that is
Mr.
not in
Secretary,
his
I have
wheelhouse.
limited time. Mr. Chairman, I will ask that you direct the witness to answer my question.
I will direct the witness to answer the question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No.
It's pretty simple.
The answer is no.
Okay. We understand Mr. Kushner was involved in the Saudi summit where these were promised. Did he try to push to deliver on these promises? That's a yes or a no?
No.
Is your testimony that documents will show that Mr. Kushner has no involvement in this whatsoever?
As I said, Mr. Cicilline, there are a number of bilateral lines of communication.
Mr. Secretary, with all due respect, I'm going to repeat the question. Is it your testimony that documents will show that Mr. Kushner had no involvement in this discussion relating to arms sales to Saudi Arabia? That's a yes or a no?
If it's that broad, I can't attest to that. But what I can attest to is that on any of our partners, we have a long, deep list of USG officials, be it executive branch
Mr.
or otherwise,
Secretary, I understand
including
the process.
Congress.
I'm asking you to answer a specific question, and you look like
I
you're
am.
not going to. Does the administration, Mr. Secretary, believe Iran is likely to attack Saudi Arabia or the UAE? That's a yes or a no.
I'm not going to go into detail on threat posture here, but there are threats that are ongoing, that are evolving against our partners as well as us. We are not going to discuss, I'm not going to spill classified in an open hearing.
Okay. The vast majority of the arms the administration wants to sell with respect to this transaction are offensive weapons, correct?
It's not limited to that. There's sustainment.
It didn't say limited. The vast majority are offensive weapons.
There are offensive weapons. There are sustainment packages.
But the
there are
vast
training packages.
majority are offensive. Isn't that correct, sir?
A number of them are offensive.
And the Saudi-led coalition has used American-made offensive weapons to strike civilian targets in Yemen. Isn't that correct?
Regrettably, there have been civilian targets that have been hit in the coalition operation.
And the emergency request includes equipment that will not be ready in some cases for months, in some cases for years. Isn't that correct?
That is part of the emergency, Congressman, is that there's been a protraction of the process. So we can get delivered immediately, we can. But because of the extended review process, yes, there's an emergency because there's been an extension on that latency of the logistics tail. So there is some...
It's hard to understand how an emergency response could take years,
Those
but
conditions
I'll
help create
accept
the
your
emergency.
representation. Finally, Mr. Secretary, you stated in your testimony, and I'm going to quote you, that, and I quote, "We review the Secretary's action, in this case to bypass Congress, as an affirmation of the value that we continue to place on our engagement with you on arms transfers and border security issues," end quote. Well, I have to say, it's a little hard to believe that we're supposed to take your complete disregard for the congressional review process as an indication that you value congressional engagement. This is gaslighting. You're claiming you're ignoring this provision is your way of affirming the role Congress plays. That's an absurdity. Can you explain that?
Our communication and our engagement with Congress never abated. There was never a cessation of it at all. So we do value that communication. Okay. This emergency was a one-time declaration authorized through statute provided by Congress
and finally,
40
then,
years
Mr. Secretary,
ago.
Final question. Are there any other emergencies on the horizon that will so enhance your appreciation of the consultative process that you plan to completely bypass Congress?
I don't have a crystal ball or a magic 8-ball like some people use as a paperweight on their desk, but I will tell you that we are constantly monitoring threat streams with our colleagues in the intelligence community. I'm not going to also opine about particular threats that may or may not be developing, especially in an open fora. Why tip our hats to our adversaries? So I can't say that there aren't future emergencies that may befall U.S. interests or our national security. That risk
Mr.
is
Secretary, the
always
point of
there.
the question was the lack of consultation. And with that, I yield back, Mr.
Thank
Chairman.
you, Mr. Cicilline. Mr. Mast.
Thank you, Chairman. I would just say I don't like to waste my time, and I don't like to ask questions twice, as I don't believe any of my colleagues do. I apologize, Mr. Chairman. I don't know the appropriate procedural request, but is there a request that we can make to move into a closed-door portion of this hearing, remove individuals of staff that do not have classified clearances or security clearances, and attempt to get the answers that we seek? Is there a procedural motion that I can make to move into that process?
Yeah, Mr. Mast, this is an open hearing, but we will schedule those sessions at an appropriate time.
So there is no option right now to ask to move into a portion of this hearing be closed door?
No, but we will in the short term have another briefing.
I thank you for committing to having another briefing in a classified session. In that, as I said, I don't like to waste my time, and I don't like to ask questions twice.
I think, if I could just interrupt for a minute, I think Mr. Secretary Cooper has to leave by about 12:30, was it? So we wouldn't be able to do that now. But we will, I promise you in the future, we'll do it.
That being the answer, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Mast. Mr. Berra.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cooper, you're the Assistant Secretary for Political and Military Affairs, correct?
Yes, Congressman.
And PM has responsibility for ensuring that proposed weapon sales comply with the Arms Export Control Act, right?
That is correct.
That's the AECA.
Correct.
So you would have been aware of both the proposed sales and the legal rationale under the AECA?
Yes, Congressman.
And that's why it was you who briefed congressional staff on the emergency declaration on May 24th?
That is correct. The declaration was issued on the 23rd. We did the formal notification, and same day did a briefing.
Thank you. And in fact, that's why you're here today. So PM would have been involved in crafting the memorandum of justification for the Secretary to explain the exercises of emergency powers under the AECA, right?
Yes, in a broad sense, but I do not want to. We cannot go into details of that crafting. But it was the Secretary's decision based on our.
But PM would be involved in crafting the justification. Great, and that information would be reflected on the clearance page of that document, correct?
Say that one more time.
The information of who drafted the justification memo would be reflected on the clearance page of that document, showing both who drafted it and who cleared it.
In a very broad general sense, that is, you identified the process.
Great. We'll expect to get that information to us within the next 48 hours, and we'll make sure H and your staff have that request in terms of who drafted and cleared that document. Which bureau had the pen on drafting the justification memo?
I'm not going to go into internal processes, but I can share in an open forum is that all these cases leading up to the declaration
just
fulfilled an interagency.
I mean, asking which bureau had the pen drafting the justification memo, that's not classified information.
There was an interagency process for all these cases that contributed to the declaration. But
that information would be reflected on the clearance page of that document, showing both, again, who drafted it and who cleared it. And again, we'll expect to get that information to us within the next 48 hours. And we will make sure H and your staff get that request in writing today. Was Merrick String involved?
Are you referring to our legal advisor?
Well, at the time of the drafting, was Merrick String, at that time he was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State.
Again, Congressman, I'm not going to talk about individuals in the department and the interagency.
But he worked for you at that time.
There are
on May 23rd,
hundreds of people in our bureau.
But on May 23rd, he worked for you. Was he a lawyer in your department during that time?
He is a lawyer in our department.
Was he a lawyer at that time? My understanding is that wasn't his position. What position does Mr. String hold now?
Mr. String is our legal advisor.
Right. So he's legal advisor to the Department of State. He's the top lawyer at the State Department, and he's in an acting capacity. When was that transition announced?
I don't remember, but I could tell you that he's not the only lawyer in the department.
He is the top lawyer in the department.
That's correct. That's correct, but he's one person.
That transition, my understanding, was announced May 24th per an email from the ELF front office around 3:30 p.m. So on the very day that this emergency declaration was sent to the Hill, according to public records, you know, this is when he got this promotion to be the top lawyer. According to public records, Mr. String was first admitted to the bar in 2013. And of course, when he was at PM, he wasn't there acting as a lawyer. So he's only practiced law for 4 years or so. And as far as we can tell, none of that was in international law, which is central to what the legal advisor does. Do you know of otherwise?
I'll go back to that. The L Bureau is a pretty robust bureau with.
But he's the top lawyer at State Department.
There's lawyers, plural, just like we say analysts.
He is the top lawyer at the State Department.
That's correct.
The website for the Office of Legal Advisor says they typically hire about 15 people for every 1,000 applicants, which is something of just over 1% for an entry-level position, not for the top lawyer. Was Mr. String promoted to this position because of his work on the Gulf arms sales?
No.
Did his promotion have any connection to work on these Gulf arms sales?
Not that I'm aware of. I would say his promotion to that position was based on his merit, his performance, and his ability to do the job.
Who would know the justification of that promotion, and who can we get that information to?
I honestly don't know.
Okay, well, we'll expect to get that information to us within 48 hours as well, and we'll make sure H and your staff has that request in writing. So you had no awareness that Mr. String was going to be promoted?
I'm not going to talk about personnel issues here, but I could tell you that it is not uncommon for personnel to do transfers within department like any other interagency move.
So your testimony is that there's no documents that would show that you were aware of Mr. String's promotion?
Of course I was aware of his promotion.
Okay, great. And we'd like to see any documents that suggest your awareness of that promotion.
The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Burchett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your leadership in shepherding us through this minefield. And thank you, sir, for being here. I'm concerned with the Saudi coalition's disregard for our end-use requirements. More specifically, the February reports that the coalition had gifted armored personnel carriers to various third-party militia groups on the ground in Yemen, including al-Qaeda-linked groups. Additionally, I was incredibly disturbed that the Houthis and the Iranians have gotten their hands on American-made MRAPs and are probably busy reverse engineering them. What steps are being taken to ensure that none of these weapons end up in our third-party hands or even the hands of our enemies, which generally third parties turn out to be?
Congressman, thank you. What I can share in this open forum is that with security partnerships, not only provision of arms and munition does not preclude us on accountability and on follow-up. So in that particular case, on the MRAPs, one of the first things I did in arriving at the department was to contact bilaterally our partners, the Emiratis. Don't want to go into detail here, but I could tell you that there are some requirements that they need to be responsive to on that. And it's not limited to this partner. This would be every partner where we do lay out some conditions that need to be met. So it's not the first time in the history of the department where we have approached a partner for not only accountability, but also some reconciling points on particular third-party transfers.
Yes, sir. I'd like to have one of those closed-door meetings, although I don't know really what good they do. I left one once early on, and I asked my colleague beside me, I said, I'm going to miss about 30 minutes of it. I guess I can probably catch it on CNN or Fox pretty quickly after I
hope
walk
not.
out here. Yeah, well, I'm afraid this, anyway. Are you concerned that this has created a precedent where non-Gulf partners may try to use near-peer competition as leverage to extract demands from the United States?
No, sir. And the reason why is because what was the prime predicate to this emergency was the threat streams from Iran. So again, want to share that while there were multiple audiences, and there certainly were several conditions contributing to the emergency determination by the Secretary, the primary one was the threat streams from Iran.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you for being here. Mr. Chairman, thank you for allowing me always to speak, and I'll yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Burchett. Mr. Espaillat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We are here today, Mr. Chairman, obviously because President Trump has declared an emergency and has authorized the U.S. sale of arms to Saudi Arabia and the UAE while circumventing Congress. Okay. The problem, Mr. Chairman, is that this administration has been discredited with regards to fabricating emergencies when there are not, and ignoring emergency when in fact there are emergencies. Mr. Chairman, I submit to you that this practice by the administration is very troubling, and as I said, it has a dismal record at fabricating emergencies where there are none, and ignoring emergencies when in fact there are. Now let's go to the tape on this one. Right? So there is hundreds and thousands of women primarily showing up at our border with little children. Many have characterized that as a humanitarian crisis. So what does this administration do? It ignores it and tries to build a wall. So there is a Muslim ban put into practice. I myself went to JFK Airport when it did, try to stop folks of Muslim faith. The two families that I assisted were both families of members of the armed forces of Muslim faith whose mother and wife were coming into the country and they were detained with the potential of being sent back. So much for a fabricated crisis. The scientific community says that there is a problem with global warming, but there is an emergency. And yet this administration chooses to walk away from the Paris Accord. And then let's go to now Saudi Arabia. MBS, Khashoggi. We all know that Khashoggi entered the Saudi embassy in Istanbul on October 2nd, 2018 at about 1 p.m. And that in fact, he was chopped up into little pieces with a bustle. Mr. Secretary, do you feel that Khashoggi is a law-abiding democratic leader? I'm sorry, MBS. Do you feel that MBS is a law-abiding democratic leader?
To your question on our partners in Riyadh, their system of government is different. They are a partner of ours. They are an important regional security partner. As you mentioned Khashoggi, however, it doesn't preclude us holding those who committed that murder accountable. That is something that the government is committed to, and I think both
Is there a problem? Is there a problem in Saudi Arabia with women's rights?
It is fair to say that we as a government continue to lean on and to continue to encourage our partners to validate rule of law, recognize the rights, the human rights of individuals.
Is there a problem in Saudi Arabia with dissidents being tracked down and disappearing, or perhaps being tortured or in jail?
Congressman, our security relationship does not preclude our work, our constant and necessary work, to get a partner like Saudi Arabia to do better.
So we're
when
dealing
it comes
with a
to
thug
human
here.
rights and open society. And
We're dealing with a thug here that we're giving arms to. Do we, as a common practice, sell arms to the Kim regime in North Korea?
Different.
Do we sell arms to Putin in Russia?
That adversary is not the same.
So we don't.
They're not a security partner of ours.
We don't sell arms to Putin. We don't sell arms to Kim because they're thugs.
Well, we
and
don't
yet
sell arms
we are
to
selling arms to
adversaries.
MBS.
We don't sell arms to those who are an existential threat to the United States and U.S. interest. Moscow is a threat. We are addressing a threat in Pyongyang. Riyadh is a security partner of ours. We are working with a security partner, one that doesn't preclude us from addressing the issues that you enumerated.
I think,
but there's still a security
Mr.
partner.
Secretary, I think that having an American citizen go into the Saudi embassy in Istanbul and disappearing is troubling, and that FBS has a troubled record with regards to women's rights, dissidents in that nation, and that we are dealing with a thug. We're arming a street thug, and that we should be ashamed of that, and that this administration once again has fabricated a crisis and has circumvented Congress. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Espaillat. Mr. Liu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Secretary Cooper, for being here. Both the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times have written articles about Charles Faulkner. He was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Legislative Affairs. Prior to that position, he lobbied for a defense contractor that made precision-guided munitions, which form a large part of these weapons sales. Did you know Mr. Faulkner?
I did not get a chance to meet him. He had departed the department before I arrived.
Was he involved in these weapons sales?
Not that I'm aware of, but I never had a chance to meet Mr. Faulkner.
Was he forced to resign?
I'm not aware of. I'm not aware, and I can't also talk about personnel actions.
Did you read the New York Times and Wall Street Journal articles about Charles Faulkner?
I saw one of the articles, I believe.
But is that article accurate?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't think so. I don't know Mr. Faulkner, but again, he had a particular function in the H Bureau, but I'm not aware of him having a role.
So you're not aware if he was involved in these?
No, sir, I'm not.
Could he have had a role in these 22?
Well, if one looks at processing with H, so we were talking earlier today about the consultative process on informal review, tiered review.
He could have had a role in that.
He would have had on the absolutely. So the notification process from a historic nature, based on how old some of these cases were.
Thank you.
Based on his time, he would have, especially ones that were 18 months, near 2 years old. He would have had, would have been aware of communicating that to Congress on the informal notification.
So part of the weapons with these precision-guided munitions, behind me is a strike at a civilian funeral in Yemen in 2016. And what happened is Saudi jets came by, dropped very precise precision-guided munitions, killed and injured hundreds of civilians. Then those jets came around again and struck the same place. As a result, the State Department and other agencies went into a huge agency review process, and they realized that precision-guided munitions were making things worse in Yemen because the Saudis were actually intending to hit the targets that they struck. We saw that last year when the Saudis very precisely struck a school bus, killing over 40 children. There was a legal memo written in the State Department about possible war crimes that the U.S. may be involved in because we were giving weapons to an organization that we knew, a coalition, that was committing war crimes. Have you seen that memo?
I'm not aware of that memo, Congressman.
In your job, do you have to make sure that weapon sales comply with the law of armed conflict?
We do.
Okay. Were you given any advice from State Department lawyers or other lawyers about whether these sales complied with the law of armed conflict?
We do. That's part of the process on the front end. So if we talk about the left side of this, and we're talking about the early stages, that part of that review takes place.
Written or oral guidance you were given?
Both in some cases.
Could we see the written guidance you were given as to how these weapon sales comply with the law of armed conflict?
As far as legal analysis or intelligence analysis, I don't think that's in my purview, but I note that. I could tell you that from when we're looking at any case, it's not just a matter of regional political policy dynamics. It does include the legal review that you mentioned. It also includes...
You were given written guidance on the law of armed conflict? About
There's always an ongoing process on any case.
I get it. Were you given any written guidance on the law of armed conflict?
There would be at sometimes. Each case
either in an open or classified setting, can we get that written guidance?
I cannot commit to release of internal deliberations. Again, that's not just legal, that's also intelligence, human rights, foreign policy, a number of considerations that go through not only the department, but external to the department.
So you know that under the law of armed conflict, in international law, personnel can be liable for war crimes if they give weapons to people they know are going to commit war crimes. So in the case of Charles Taylor, he was prosecuted for war crimes. The United States government actually cited that case in a supplemental governmental filing. So, so let me ask you this. Do you agree with that principle, that if we sold a whole bunch of weapons to a coalition that we knew was going to commit war crimes, that we could also be liable for war crimes personnel?
Our security partner, our partner in the Gulf, our partners in the Gulf, we are working with them to mitigate civilian casualties. So as you noted, it's not just precision. I would agree with you on that. It's about process. It's about getting it right, getting it good on mitigating. So it isn't just a matter of precision weapons, because that isn't enough. It is a matter of targeting integrity. It's also getting a partner up to a standard that we would not only find acceptable in the U.S., but as well as in other fora.
Thank you. And the Republican-controlled U.S. Senate is about to pass 22 resolutions blocking these arms sales on a bipartisan basis because those standards have not been met. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Liu. Ms. Wild.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Greetings, Secretary Cooper. The administration informed Congress just last week that included in the administration's emergency authorization for arms is a provision that allows Raytheon Company, a top American defense firm, as you are aware, to team with the Saudis to build high-tech bomb parts in Saudi Arabia. Previously, the U.S. has guarded such technology, and we've seen what has happened in China as American companies were forced to produce key technological parts of wind turbines in Chinese plants. In January of 2018, a wind turbine company based in Beijing called Sinovel was found guilty of stealing trade secrets. Specifically, they obtained software developed by the U.S. company AMSC to manage the flow of electricity from wind turbines into the electrical grid. So my question to you is, can you assess the risk of Saudi Arabia potentially stealing highly sensitive defense information that will be used to build these weapons?
Thank you, Congressman Wild. And you are correct to observe that when we're working with any partner, be it Saudi Arabia or anybody, that as far as protection of not only trade information, but unique technologies do need to be protected. It is part of our risk assessment in any transfer of arms, as well as any transfer of tech. This is not just Saudi Arabia, this is all partners. To your particular question, those are not unique technologies that have not already been introduced into the ecosystem, so to speak, with Saudi Arabia. And another point that was part of the analysis was also how that would impact or not impact our defense industrial base back here at home. So when we're looking at it from a global supply chain aspect, not new to the region, not new to the partner, certainly doesn't preclude protections or governors and assess not an impact on our industrial base as well.
Let me stop you there. So is it your testimony that the technology that will be shared is out there in the chain of knowledge and information in this industry?
Specific to Saudi Arabia, it's not a new application, but it's not open for, if that's what you're asking.
So you're saying it's technology that Saudi Arabia already has that we are sharing with them? That
they haven't already been exposed to is probably a better way of putting it.
Exposed to in what way?
Through our mill-to-mill, our security cooperation status.
So that is your testimony there's no new technology that is being shared with the Saudis?
There's technology associated with this manufacturing that is not new.
I don't think that's an answer to my question. My
All
question to you is, very specifically, is there any new technology being shared with the Saudis as part of this emergency authorization for arms?
In this declaration, I am not aware of there being new technology. Not only not new to the partner, but also not new as far as what's been presented to Congress.
I'm not sure that's an answer, but let me just move on. The arms sale notification states that the Saudis and Emiratis will co-produce some of the weapons in the arms sale package, meaning they will co-produce with the United States. That means that this weapons deal will ship American jobs, manufacturing, and technology overseas. At least 3 of the 22 arms sale licenses would allow a U.S. defense company to shift production of military items to Saudi Arabia and the Emiratis, which will hurt American workers and could cost Americans jobs. First question, why is the co-production needed and included in this deal?
The co-production is part of our reassurance of our allies. To your point about the industrial base, we want to make sure that these particular partners not only had that reassurance, it's to send a message that we do trust them as a partner. The assessment aspect
Wait a second. Wait. We're selling them arms, right?
So
why do they need assurance that they can trust us?
This is interoperability. This is also integration. This is a global supply chain, and these are parts that are American produced. So when we talked about the assessment question on our impact or not impact on our industrial base, that did factor. This is inclusive of American-made components
I understand
that would be manufactured.
I understand it's a co-production process, but it seems to me that what we've got is a situation where this arms sale deal and emergency authority is basically shipping American jobs and manufacturing abroad, right?
It's actually creation of jobs. It's a proliferation of jobs. So you could call it a positive proliferation, but it's inclusive of jobs for manufacturing components here that are integrated with those components in manufacturing abroad. This is something that was part of the assessment and did not see an incursion upon essentially our bottom line.
I'm not seeing the justification. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Levin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thanks for coming. I know people talked about having a further classified briefing. I'd welcome that. However, as a couple of my colleagues have discussed, Secretary Pompeo briefed members of Congress in a classified setting on May 20th and 21st. Yet there was no mention made of the need for the emergency that was announced 3 days later. I know because I was there. Had there been discussions about an emergency declaration before he briefed us? Had you been involved in any discussions about the need for an emergency declaration before he briefed us?
I could tell you that there's ongoing...
Was there before? Sir, we don't have a lot of time.
Okay,
yes or no?
Yeah, Congressman Levin. Certainly looking at what we call tools, the emergency declaration was certainly in the toolkit, no different than us
So why didn't the Secretary say a dang thing about it when he came and briefed us in a classified setting?
I'm not going to...
3 days before you announced.
I'm not going to take a guess or gander, but I could provide here right now is that you had an emerging, changing posture
so within
on the
3
threat
days,
streams.
an emergency was created that required that declaration.
Congressman, yes.
In the so your testimony here is in those 2 or 3 intervening days, an emergency arose that required a declaration.
Yes, and I would parallel this to also imposition of sanctions. I mean, we have a number of tools in our diplomatic
Sir, with all due
deterrence.
respect, I just don't think that's credible. Let me move on. You said here, and I'm quoting you as best I can earlier, holding a partner accountable doesn't prevent us from working with that partner, quote unquote, and you reference human rights, civil society. In what way is the United States holding Saudi Arabia accountable for the gruesome murder of the Washington Post journalist, Mr. Khashoggi? How are we holding him accountable?
There's been a line of communication, not only by the Secretary, but others, with Riyadh on
So we're
Mr.
chit-chatting
Khashoggi.
about it in private.
And there is no question, I don't think there's any question or daylight on a concurrence that his murder was prosecuted in a fashion that needs to be addressed and needs to be made accountable, and those involved need to be brought to justice. As to that...
Was the Crown Prince involved, sir?
I do not know.
The CIA has concluded that he was. Has the President of the United States and the Secretary admitted the findings of our intelligence agencies that the Crown Prince ordered the murder of Mr. Khashoggi?
As a 20-year member of the intelligence community, I am not going to talk classified information in here. I will say, though, that there is no disagreement on anybody in the administration or on Capitol Hill that Mr. Khashoggi's murder needs to be addressed.
Okay,
and,
so
and those who prosecuted the murder
Okay,
need
let me
to be
move on.
brought to justice.
I have limited time. I appreciate your answer. In what way are we holding Saudi Arabia accountable for the war crimes it has committed by murdering civilians on multiple occasions in Yemen, and for causing a famine in Yemen through the prosecution of this war that we have been actively involved in? In what way are we holding them accountable, besides vetoing congressional resolutions about it?
We're also combating the Houthi threat, which
I'm not asking about the Houthi threat,
Well, the Houthi
sir.
threat contributed to the famine.
Sir,
So
the Houthi threat does not necessitate war crimes.
Houthis mining grain mines and denying access
You just want to
to
change
food.
the subject. We can have another hearing
Okay.
about Houthi war crimes. I'm talking about Saudi. You're selling arms to Saudi Arabia, and you're making a simplistic black and white thing. This is the good guys. This is the bad guys.
It's not binary. It's not simplistic, Congressman Levin. I think no one here would ever say that this.
So in what way are we holding Saudi Arabia accountable for the horrific crimes it is committing in Yemen?
Our partnership with this security partner,
namely Saudi Arabia.
Correct.
You can
And
name
they're one. They're not the only one, but they're one. That particular partner in the region. Our partnership with Riyadh does. It's incumbent upon us to provide not only the munitions, but also the training and the sustainment that goes with it. That's inclusive of our relationship to get them
Sir,
to be a better partner.
My time has expired. In the end, we all have to answer for our actions in the same way. And I just pray that we take more seriously the horrific reality on the ground in Yemen and change course immediately. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Gentleman yields back. I'm going to call on Ms. Spanberger to ask a question and Mr. Malinowski to take the chair and then ask his question after Ms. Spanberger. Ms. Spanberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here today. As follow-up to my colleague, Mr. Levin's comment, I want to give you the opportunity to perhaps correct what it is you said. The statement related to Jamal Khashoggi's murder, a Virginia resident, you said his murder was prosecuted in a fashion that needs to be addressed. It is my hope that the department doesn't think that any state-sponsored murder that happens in a consulate is ever one that is perhaps just discussed related to how it was actually prosecuted. I hope that you'll denounce that murder. Would you like to take the opportunity to do that now?
Thank you. We have denounced the murder, and of course, we would never abide by state-sponsored acts like that. So no, there's no daylight on that one.
Thank you. Mr. Cooper, in your testimony, you've repeatedly referred to the need to provide our partners in the region with defensive capabilities. In fact, you say specifically this is not intended to be an escalatory military step, and yet many of the 22 cases are distinctly offensive weapons, including the Paveway precision-guided munitions, or smart bombs. We have a picture of that weapon system right here. Can you explain to me the disconnect to why we're providing offensive and extremely lethal weapons for apparently defensive purposes?
Thank you. So as far as weapons capability, we want to make sure that not only these partners in the region, if they are actually carrying equities for us, that it's not a matter of just their own sovereignty, but ensuring that they are providing protection for our equities. So it isn't just a matter of saying we want to make sure that your sovereignty is protected. They are carrying weight for us. As far as precision aspect, as discussed earlier, it is contributing to what would be considered the improvement or targeting integrity in any realm to ensure that the target is actually the one that is supposed to be hit is hit versus a categorical or a less precise target.
Okay, so let's talk about that targeting integrity. With the next image we have here, this is actually a school bus that was hit by one of these paveways. More than 40 children died when this precision-guided weapon hit a school bus. More than 50 people killed. more than 40 of them school children. So when we're talking about the offensive weapons that we deem, that the department now deems is in an emergency exigent circumstance, one that the department chooses to circumvent the congressional power, Article 1 of the Constitution, which gives us the authority to approve weapon sales of these types of weapons to entities that will commit mass atrocities like this. I just want to make sure we're clear on the level of lethality that we're discussing. And that brings me to a point. You've referred multiple times to a protracted process, and I would remind you, sir, that the protracted process you are bemoaning is in fact the constitutional process that we as members of Congress have a responsibility to exercise when we are selling our weapon systems that are this lethal to countries abroad, be they allies or otherwise. And you've specifically said this is a one-time event, but I would note that there is nothing specified in this statute that says the department can have this one-time circumvent effort around constitutional authority. Are you committing to this being a one-time event?
One-time event is conditions-based, but I will tell you, if you look at the history and the precedent, this is only the 5th time in 40 years that this has been applied. The first time was in 1979 during the Carter administration. This is only the 5th time. So it is, you're right, it is highly unusual. The circumstances are unusual, but it is a part of that toolkit for diplomatic deterrence.
So I would also note, having spent time in national security myself, these are not toolkits for diplomatic returns. These are toolkits for more aggressive, offensive natures. And speaking of offensive, the U.S. is supporting the Saudi offensive efforts against the Houthis. But where does that lead us? We've talked a lot about Iran. We've talked a lot about the escalation with Iran. We're now supplying these weapons to Saudi Arabia and another number of other partners in the Gulf, including fighter jets, precision-guided munitions, anti-tank missiles. What is it we're preparing for, sir? I did attend that classified briefing as well. There was no clear discussion that some major incident was imminent, and therefore the need to circumvent Congress. What is it we're preparing for that we are arming our allies in the region with this many offensive weapons?
On readiness and capability, we could talk further in a closed brief. I'd also say there are some threat streams that are not just directly tied to U.S. interest. I was able to talk about one here today because it was open source. So the attack on the civilian, the international airport in Saudi Arabia.
That happened today, more than 2 weeks after this emergency declaration was put in place.
But I'm using that as an example in an open forum of that's not unique. So we do need to have a further conversation about those types of impacts and capital I impacts. So threat streams definitely are a factor, but it's not, when I say streams, it's direct threats to us, the indirect threats to us via proxies and other locations outside the region, and then direct threats to our partners in the region.
And many of my colleagues have raised the issue of this being a general trend that we're seeing out of this administration to circumvent the responsibility of Congress. And I would like to, again, note for the record that we also have constitutional responsibility as it relates to any aggressive war-making actions, be it with Iran or anyone else. So I hope that if the administration is indeed trying to prepare itself for any sort of offensive hostilities, they will begin respecting the Constitution, Article 1 of the Constitution, and come before Congress to make their case. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I'll recognize myself. Secretary, you opened your testimony by referring to the last time this happened in 1984 when we shipped a bunch of Stinger missiles to Saudi Arabia to defend against a threat from Iran. Can you tell us what a Stinger missile is?
It is an offensive capability.
It's a weapon for shooting down aircraft that are attacking you.
Yeah.
It's a defensive weapon.
Yeah.
It was designed to defend Saudi Arabia against potential air attacks from Iran. And at that point, actually, the department made explicitly the case that the reason these weapons were being provided is they were available immediately to help the Saudis deal with an imminent threat.
Right.
We are now talking about precision-guided munitions, paveways, and the like. These are not defensive weapons. These are weapons designed to enable Saudi Arabia to continue conducting airstrikes in Yemen. Isn't that right?
That is correct, but I would go back to the defensive capability issue that you brought up. Our partners, we do provide, there are some defensive systems that we have provided that are anti-aircraft, air artillery, ADA capabilities. However, when one looks at a concentric ring of security, we're not just talking about particular capabilities that are coming in or incurring upon sovereign space of our partners. There's addressing the threat streams that are direct to their sovereignty, but also in a regional capacity. So,
Well,
yes,
sure,
those
but
are offensive
They're offensive
capabilities.
weapons. They're not going to help the Saudis defend against attacks on their shipping or missile attacks on the airport in Riyadh. You also mentioned at one point earlier today that precision weapons are helpful in avoiding civilian casualties in Yemen, which I find that rather strange. They are using precision weapons now, are they not? They've been using precision weapons to precisely hit hospitals, schools, bridges, humanitarian targets. These are precision strikes. So how is the provision of additional PGMs going to help them avoid civilian casualties? Help us there.
No one would deny the tragedy, the heartbreak of the civilian casualties. There's no question about that. There is room to improve the integrity of the targeting process. It does not preclude us from making sure that our partners, as we are doing, as is reported, to get them to be in a better place to apply precision weapons in a precise manner for targets that are not civilian targets, that are not civilian entities.
Well, we've been trying to do that for 5 years. In March, there was a strike by the Saudis, presumably using precision weapons, on a Save the Children hospital in Yemen. That hospital was on a no-strike list that we provided to the Saudis, was it not?
I do not know, but it should have been on a no-strike list.
Well, there you have it. And yet you have testified today, Secretary, that the reason we are doing this is because we need to reassure the Saudis to trust us. And they continue year after year in Yemen to hit targets that we have specifically asked them not to hit. And our response to that is to blow past congressional objections, to give them these weapons so that they can trust us. Isn't the issue whether we can trust them?
With any partnership, including Saudi Arabia, there's an ongoing discourse, ongoing engagement. There is work to be done. But to walk away from our partner would exacerbate the situation in Yemen.
Well,
there are civilian targets that have
away.
been victim by Houthi targeting. But to walk away from our partner would exacerbate the current situation.
No one is suggesting we walk away. Let me shift to one last issue. Several members have brought up the Khashoggi killing, and setting aside the controversial question of who ordered it, did they set out to kill him or kidnap him, would you say it's fair to assume that the Saudi government's intention in targeting Khashoggi was to send a message to Saudi exiles in countries like the United States who are critical of the Saudi regime? Is that a fair starting assumption, would you say?
I'm not going to assess the assumption, but what I can provide is that from a USG standpoint is that we do support dissident voices, be wherever they are located, Saudi Arabia or any other partner, that we don't silence civil society, that we actually bolster and support civil society.
Well, understood. The reason I asked, are you familiar with Section 6 of the Arms Export Control Act?
If you're referring to 36C, are you talking about Section?
No, Section 6. It says that no export licenses may be issued under this Act with respect to any country determined by the President to be engaged in a consistent pattern of acts of intimidation or harassment directed against individuals in the United States. Have you looked at this case and others with respect to the application of the Arms Export Control Act?
That is correct. And that was part of the calculus on all these cases when they entered the congressional informal process, the review process, the tiered review process. Again, some of these predating the murder of Mr. Khashoggi, some of these actually after the murder of Mr. Khashoggi.
So you see no pattern of intimidation of individuals in the United States by the Saudis?
Addressing any kind of intimidation by any partner is not precluded from any assessment. That also includes, I think what you're referring to in the statute is inclusive of the human rights report that is issued by every country team, and that is also part of the calculus.
All right, well, I yield back and recognize Congresswoman Omar.
Thank you, Chairman. So it's no secret that, within line of what my colleague from New York said, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates are brutal regimes. They export brutality. They crush democratic movements abroad directly and indirectly. I also believe that they have been funders of terrorists. And we have heard reports that they're transferring U.S. weapons to al-Qaeda. I believe that our relationship with them in its current form is immoral, but it's not only immoral, it's counterproductive to our national security. I believe in trusting them to protect our needs and protecting us against terroristic threats is like trusting a thief to protect your shop. This administration selling them billions of dollars of weapons is dangerous and it's outrageous. Doing so is open disregard for the will of Congress and the American people, slap in the face to our democracy and our values. Twice in the last 25 years, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates have invaded Bahrain to crash democratic uprising. The Saudis actively supported the Egyptian coup in 2013. In April of this year, the United Nations finally believed they were on the verge of negotiating peace in Libya. This has instead collapsed into a civil war. Haftar has waged his bloody campaign with Saudi backing and Emirate weapons. More recently in Sudan, Hemeti visited MPS in Jeddah, and shortly after that, him and the Janjaweed immediately began murdering democratic protesters by the hundreds. It's clear that state sees Saudi hand in the crackdown. Since David Hale called MPS's brother, Khalid bin Salam, to ask him to use Saudi influence to stop the killings. This is a disturbing pattern of destabilization and totalitarianism. Backing the Saudi and the Emirates is backing war crimes and crimes against humanity. Providing them with arms is complicity. So I ask you, how can we make sure that U.S. weapons do not end up in the hands of the Janjaweed? How can we ensure that U.S. weapons aren't being used to murder political protesters in Sudan?
Congresswoman Omar, thank you. As to our partnerships, and you mentioned Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, and there are some other partners that are either developing or devolving in some cases. All of our partnerships on a security sense, including some that are economic, are predicated on our interests, on U.S. interests. But that's not new. That's not unique to this administration or the previous administration or back to the time of Washington. We develop partnerships because of what works best for U.S. interests. Mm-hmm. It doesn't preclude us, though, from holding partners accountable, not just on human rights, access to civil society, but also holding accountable on protecting our interests. And so when we're either provision of a weapon system or a capacity or a certain kind of sustainment, with that comes a relationship. So it's a long-term investment. That is what makes us unique to our adversaries.
To the question of how can we assure that this partnership can be trusted to protect us from eventually having some of our weapons end up in the hands of terrorists is my question, and making sure that it doesn't go into murdering political protesters in Sudan, because what we have seen is that our weapons have been used to assault schools, bridges, hospitals in places like Yemen. We've seen the Saudis' involvement and their footprint in Libya. We've seen their involvement and footprint in Somalia with Al-Shabaab. So what I'm asking you is, how can you assure the American people that we are not emboldening them to continue to reign their terror in destabilizing that region when we trust them to be a partner in stabilizing it?
Yeah. Saudi Arabia has been a long-time security partner in the region for almost 40 years. It does not and never has precluded us from accountability on the front end of the process, not just on Saudi arms transfers and security cooperation, security assistance. There is a non-proliferation aspect to it, and I think an interesting point you brought up is in our assessment and our consideration we do on the interagency is making sure that in a mill-to-mill sense, there isn't spillage, so to speak, into law enforcement, and that law enforcement entities are not in receipt of systems, because mill to mill, those relationships are for sovereignty and security, not for the crackdown of civil society, not for the crackdown of their own people.
Secretary Cooper, my time's up. What I will say is I don't believe this is the case of spillage. This is an active engagement. Report after report has shown that this is not an accident. This is a part of what the Saudis and the Emirates are engaged in, and I hope that we will reassess our relationship with them in trying to make sure that we are stabilizing that region and that we're continuing to engage in our war against terror.
Representative Deutsch. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is Secretary Cooper. The administration has repeatedly asserted that issuing these licenses is essential to deal with an emergency. In fact, you said earlier in our hearing it was a policy decision by the Secretary of State based on an emergency so urgent that you can't even wait for a 30-day congressional review. In fact, Secretary's determination on May 24th is based on exactly that finding. That was the determination, I would just remind you again, that came 3 days after a classified briefing for the entire House with the Secretary of State where, while it was clearly under consideration, he didn't take the time to even mention it to the Congress. But you've clearly made an assessment that the weapons and ordnance in these licenses are available for delivery very soon, right, if it's an emergency?
Yes, the ones that were direct commercial sales, what was already...
No. Let me just, but that's a if it's an emergency to deliver these, you've considered when they can be delivered, right? So
That is part of the calculus.
Right. So you've got to have specific information about when each of these items in these licenses will be available for delivery to the Saudis and Emiratis, right?
Again, part of the calculus.
I'm just asking if you've done that. You've done that for each of these, right?
Yes. So from not just the Department of State side, from the interagency side, regardless if there's an emergency status, it's incumbent upon us.
I understand.
It's a timing issue, sir.
Secretary, no, all right, I get it. I've sat through this whole hearing.
Okay.
It is a timing issue. And it's such an emergency that you couldn't wait 30 days. So what I'm trying to figure out is, and what I'd ask you is, if you could provide the information to the committee here, which we've not had an opportunity to hear from you on, when each of these items is going to be ready for delivery.
I can't say on specificity on each one. What I can say is if it's a DCS sale, a direct commercial sale, if it's already off the shelf, it's going. It's moving now. What wouldn't be moving is if it's in a manufacturing line.
I get it. I understand.
Okay.
We all understand that. That's what I'm asking you. I don't need you to tell me. No, let me just finish. I don't need you to tell me if it's manufactured, it's going to come later. I want to know if this is an emergency, what's the timeline? How long will it take? I'll get to the other ones. I'll get to the commercially made ones. How long will it take to manufacture these to produce them for delivery?
To your question,
yeah.
Per case, not all cases.
Yeah.
Per case, it is conditions-based. Part of it is contractually based. So we can talk based on it's either going to be a few months or longer, which is contributed to the emergency calculus.
I got you. So it's a few months. It's a few months or longer for all but the commercial, which I'll get to.
That's
it's
correct.
A few months or longer. So it's such an emergency. A few months or longer for every single one of the other items, but there wasn't 30 days for Congress to review. You understand why that's so difficult for this institution to understand, right?
The review never stopped, Congressman. The review is currently happening at the time.
There was no form. Come on, Assistant Secretary, please don't. You said earlier that the review is ongoing because we know about this. There was no formal 30-day notice, correct?
The informal notification.
There was no formal 30-day notice given.
Congress was in communication with us.
Was there a formal 30-day notice given?
The formal
yes or no? Can you direct him to answer that, Mr. Chairman?
It's a pretty simple
yes. Yeah, yes, there was formal notification in the form of an emergency declaration by the Secretary of State.
That is not what I'm asking you, and that's the problem that we have with the way this whole thing has been handled. Let me move on, and you understand that, Assistant Secretary, and I don't appreciate the attempt to try to be clever and simply refuse to answer the question, which is no. Pursuant to law, you've not granted that 30-day notice. You've gone forward with this emergency on a list of items that none of which will be available for at least months, except for the ones I'm going to talk about now. And you couldn't find time to give us the 30-day notice. Let me talk about the commercial ones. Over $2 billion of precision-guided munitions are available now. Is it typical for those to be manufactured before approval is given by Congress?
There are going to be items that are going to be on the shelf ready for any partner at any time.
I want to make sure I understand that. So one company manufactured over $2 billion of precision-guided munitions just to have on the shelf in case it was decided that perhaps they'd be available. Someone might have interest in purchasing them. Is that what you're telling us?
There are other weapons systems that are readily available.
I understand, but with respect to
if it's an earlier generation item, it's going to be existing in stock.
I want to know about these $2 billion in PGMs that are scheduled to be delivered to the Saudis and the Emiratis by one company. You're telling me that that company built these hoping one day to have a buyer, that it wasn't part of a longer plan, that it wasn't part of a discussion that the president had when he was in Saudi Arabia 2 years ago, that none of that happened. They just built them and, oh, here we come, perhaps we'll have a chance to sell them.
I would offer that Saudi Arabia is not the only partner that we work with in security cooperation and security assistance. So that particular item, PGMs, wouldn't be limited to just Saudi Arabia.
I
have to be ruthless on time because we have 8 minutes, 7 minutes to vote, and we still have Mr. Allred. And
we do. I don't think it's too much to ask whether the Assistant Secretary is telling us that $2.5 billion, over $2 billion of precision-guided munitions manufactured to be sold to the Saudis and Emiratis weren't actually manufactured for that purpose, and it's a coincidence that they're available now pending this emergency declaration.
I would say that the non-answer does answer the question. Mr. Allred?
Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. Like my colleague, Mr. Levin, I attended the classified briefing on May 21st. And the question that Mr. Levin posed to you, that an emergency merged, you said that an emergency emerged between the classified briefing on May 21st on Iran and the notification to necessitate the use of an emergency authorities. When was the decision memo prepared?
Thank you, Congressman Allred. The decision process certainly developed with the threat streams, but I'd offer, as far as having it as a known toolkit, has always been there. So any Secretary of State knows that they have, as authorized through statute by Congress, that they have this emergency declaration as an option.
Excuse me. Are you aware when the memo was prepared?
Yes, the memo was prepared.
When was that?
It would have been right before we issued the declaration.
So it was prepared before the briefing on May 21st?
It was prepared and issued at the time of declaration.
It's prepared all at once.
But to be fair, the ongoing analysis and the monitoring of the threat streams well predates May 21st threat brief, hence the necessity to have Secretary Pompeo and the Acting Secretary of Defense Shanahan come here and brief Congress. So,
yes. And you know, what I don't appreciate is that when Congress assembles and we receive a briefing, that there's an emergency declaration made 3 days later that we weren't made aware of. That should have been given to us at that time. That's part of our oversight responsibilities. So if the memo was prepared before that briefing, which I'm going to ask some very directed questions in writing that I hope will be responded to about when that was prepared, I want to know why we were not briefed on that at that time when we could have asked questions about this. So do you have an answer to that question? Do you know why Congress was not briefed at the time on May 21st by the Secretary of State, the Acting Secretary of Defense, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff about an emergency declaration that's going to be made 3 days later?
in a broad sense, Congress was briefed, and on 2 counts. The first count is before May 21st, there was already the ongoing consultative process, not only on these 22 cases relevant to Iran and the emergency declaration, but also any other host of cases that we have before Congress on other partners in other parts of the world. That was already happening anyway. What was unique, as you noted, was the necessity for the executive branch to come to Congress and update Congress on what was been identified on very specific threat streams that were of concern and direct threats to U.S. interests, U.S. persons, as well as our partners.
Okay. I'm going to try and get to the bottom of this because I want to know whether or not Congress was kept in the dark. That's what I want to know. We are the duly elected representatives of the American people, and we have a constitutional responsibility to oversee what you are doing in the name of the American people. And if that decision was reached before we were briefed, I want to know why we weren't told about it. And if it was reached after that briefing, then I want to know that as well. I want to know what went into that decision making. Because to me, this sounds like, and it seems like, as many of my colleagues have said, an attempt just basically to circumvent Congress because we did not agree with the decision to sell these arms to Saudi Arabia because of what they're doing in Yemen with these weapons. The rationale you have given centers around Iran. And I want to ask you, as I've asked some of your colleagues in the administration, whether or not you accept the United States intelligence assessment by the CIA with high confidence that Mohammed bin Salman ordered Jamal Khashoggi's assassination, whether you personally accept that assessment.
I am not going to talk about any intelligence assessments.
That's not no, I'm asking whether you accept an intelligence assessment.
I'm not going to talk about any particular assessments, not only on posture, not only on threat, not on any assessment in the IC in an open hearing.
Oh, this is something that can't be shared with the American people, whether or not you accept the CIA's own assessment?
We're talking about assessments. Okay. We're not talking about...
Was the declaration of emergency dependent on a CIA assessment or on an intelligence assessment, broadly speaking?
The emergency declaration absolutely included threat reporting, some of it raw, some of it finished intelligence.
So do you see the problem here? Don't answer that. The problem here is that you're willing to accept an assessment here that serves your ends and what you want to do, which is sell arms that the Congress does not want you to sell to an ally. But you're not willing to accept that assessment when it goes to holding that ally responsible for the murder of an American resident, of a journalist. What happens when the United States of America starts sanctioning murders abroad? What happens to the world order when we don't stand up and say something? When the Russians are able to kill someone in Great Britain, we say something, but we won't say something when the Saudis do. This is not who we are, and I think that you know that.
Thank you. Secretary Cooper, we got about 2 minutes left. In your testimony earlier, you said, when our adversaries sell weapons of war, they do not place the same, if any, premium that we do in addressing the risk that the capabilities that we provide may contribute to the abuses of human rights or violations of international humanitarian law. Do you acknowledge the likelihood these weapons would in fact contribute to an abuse of human rights or a violation of international law?
Congressman, with all partners, we are committed to mitigate any of those abuses. And when we conduct our interagency assessments on any transfer, on any sale, that is calculated in there. It is also not just a part of statute. It's actually part of our policy. Our conventional arms transfer policy mandates that we guarantee and that we ensure that as we move forward in the consultative process with Congress, that we are looking at how we mitigate those risks, and that we also provide.
The guarantees? What guarantees do you have with the Saudis or the Emiratis that these weapons won't be used against civilians in Yemen? What guarantees?
Particular to the Saudis in this partnership is that this comes with not only the receipt of systems or munitions or weapons, along with that comes our capacity training, our precision training, our rule of law, our rule of armed conflict training. This is us being coupled with a partner to make them a better partner, not just make them a capable partner, make them a better partner. It's incumbent upon us to do this. Walking away from a partner increases risk, exposes potential risks for a more difficult, more catastrophic situation.
What type of commitment do we have that they're going to actually do that?
Reportedly, we are getting commitments from the government that they have acknowledged the room to improve, the room to be a better partner and actually mitigate civilian casualties. There is an acknowledgement.
This is the same guy, the same folks that made the deal that took care of Khashoggi with a bone saw, the same guys that kidnapped the Prime Minister of Lebanon, the same guys have disappeared hundreds of dissidents that disagreed. Same group, that's the same group you made the deal with?
Our relationship with Saudi Arabia is almost 4 decades old. Our relationship with Saudi
4
Arabia—
decades old and going the wrong direction.
It is a relationship that is long invested, and they are carrying our water, and they're carrying our equities on our behalf in a very difficult, fraught region with direct threats to us, to our persons and our interest. It doesn't preclude us, though, as you noted, it doesn't preclude us from working with Saudi Arabia or any of partners to ensure that they have improved their processes, that it's not just about precision, that it is about more dedication and delicacy.
The improvements seem to be going the wrong way. That's my clear inclination, and everybody else in this committee. It's not getting better, it's getting worse by the arrogance of the Crown Prince. We're all done. Thank you for your testimony. Adjourned.
Thank you, sir.